Gentlemen, good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening at St. John's Synagogue to commemorate Yom Hashoah. The full name is actually Yom Hashoah B'Hagvura, the day of the Holocaust remembrance and strength. And I think being in the presence of a Holocaust survivor, Ruth Posner, gives us all tremendous strength. What's actually very interesting, when the Knesset chose today, the 28th day of Nisan, to be the day where we mark Yom HaShoah in 1951, there were many discussions which date should be chosen. Perhaps it should be on the 17th of Elul, which was the day when the Second World War began. Perhaps it should be on other dates. But this date was chosen, and it's actually 1 week before Yom Ha'atzmaut, 1 week after Pesach. And I think actually there's a bit of an idea here. Part of Yom HaShoah is really the Jewish story, knowing where we come from and where we are going, knowing our roots, our history, our background, and being the torchbearers to carry that history with us for future generations. So in a few moments I'm going to say the memorial prayer for Yom HaShoah, followed by the next generation that members of the youth of this community are going to stand up to light 6 candles, following which I'd be delighted to introduce Karen Pollock, the Chief Executive of the Holocaust Educational Trust, who's going to say a few words of introduction for our guest speaker this evening. So please be upstanding for the memorial prayer. I'll recite this in Hebrew and in English. Amolei Rachamim, Dayan Almonos Va'avi Yisomim, Al no techazeh v'tizabei Godam Yisrael, Shenishbach Hamayim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona, Al Kampi Ashkina, B'ma'alos Kedoshim V'Taharim, K'zoh HaRakia, Me'irim V'Mazhirim Es Nishmoseihem, Sha'arim Avos Alfei Yisrael, Anoshim V'Noshim, Yelodim V'Yelodos, Shenehergu, V'Nishchatu, V'Nisrafu, V'Nechnaku, V'Nikvaru Chayim, V'Atzot Asher Nigar Bohen, Yad HaTzorah HaGermani V'Grov, Kulam Kedoshim V'Taharim V'Bohem Goanim V'Tzadikim, Azeh Halvonon Adirei HaTorah, V'Gan Eden Teimin Avosam, Lochein B'Arachmim Yastirei V'Sei Sekenofov, La'olamim, V'Yitzor B'Tzorah Chayim Es Nishmotzam, Amen. God, full of mercy, justice of widows and father of orphans, please do not be silent and hold your peace for the blood of Israel that shed like water. Grant fitting rest on the wings of the divine presence in the heights of the holy and pure, who shine and radiate like light and radiance in heaven to the souls of the millions of Jews, men and women, children, who were murdered, slaughtered, burned, strangled, and buried alive in the lands touched by the German enemy and its followers. They were all holy and pure. Among them were great scholars and righteous individuals, cedars of Lebanon and noble masters of Torah. May the Garden of Eden be their resting place. Therefore, Master of compassion, shelter them in the shadow of your wings forever, and bind their souls in the bonds of everlasting life. The Lord is their heritage. May they rest in peace, and let us say Amen. Amen. Please be seated. I'd now like to invite members of the youth of our community to stand up to light the candles.
I'm marching in honor of Louis Cooper, age 2. I'm lighting this candle in honor of Jacob Fish, age 10. lighting this candle in memory of Rahel Gantz, age 7.
And that's Miss Candle in honor of Rahel Gantz, age 5.
I'm lighting this candle in honor of Ava Briskina, age 7. I'm lighting this candle in honor of Zena Diana, age 2.
Thank you so much. As we see young members of the community, we feel this passing on the torchbearers who will take the lessons that they will hear tonight, please God, to your friends. You'll be able to tell your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren that once you heard the survivor, you heard the story of Ruth Posner live in person. And please God, you'll be able to carry that on, and the memories of all those people that we remember this evening shall be for a blessing. Please have a seat. It gives me great pleasure and honour to introduce Karen Pollock Mbe, who is the Chief Executive of the Holocaust Education Trust. Karen, for decades, has been living this work, teaching both Jews and non-Jews across the country, impacting and changing the national curriculum in this country, making such an impact through her writing, through her work, and through the impression that she's made. And we're so honoured that you've come here this evening after a very, very busy Yom Hashoah, which is really probably the busiest day in the calendar for you, to come and spend some time here with us at St. John's Synagogue and to introduce our survivor this evening. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, a very overly generous and kind introduction, and thank you all for being here, and it really is a great honour for me to be here. I wanted to think about a few things I wanted to share before really I introduce the main speaker of the night and why you're all here. The first thing is I just wanted to reflect on the candles that were lit and the memory of those children that we heard the different names of and ages. 1.5 million children were murdered during the Holocaust. It's a figure that's impossible to even imagine, and when we put that within the total of the 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered, it's a staggering number and it's unimaginable. But they all had dreams and aspirations. They all had hopes for the future that were cut short because of the Nazi ideology against Jews. And so it's extremely touching and powerful to see young people remembering other young people who were so brutally murdered. But it's also why for me Yom HaShoah is so important. You'll all be aware that a day has gained huge traction in this country. We have a National Holocaust Memorial Day on January the 27th, and that marks the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and is an opportunity for people across the country to remember. Yom HaShoah is for us as Jews to remember what happened to the Jewish people, the unique experience of Jewish people during this time. Jews were targeted, Jews were picked out for annihilation, and if the Nazis had got their way, they would have wiped Jews off the face of the earth. It's a horrible thing to say, but that's the reality of it, and I sometimes think it's important we just take a moment to remember that. There are all sorts of universal messages we can learn about the Holocaust, but there's a fundamental one, which is that Jews were targeted. and it was a result of anti-Semitism, and if it hadn't, yes, we can say that it should stop in its tracks today and we should fight racism and anti-Semitism today. I believe that, and we should, but we shouldn't underestimate what happened and what was the threat for us as a people. So it's a real privilege to be here with you. I marked Yom Hashoah as well yesterday evening, where there were a smaller number of survivors than there normally would be. There were some of their families, but we're at this time where the testimony and the live access to testimony is getting to be a much more slim opportunity, and that's why tonight is so important and so special. Before I introduce Ruth, I just wanted to mention something else. I came here, as I mentioned earlier to some people that I was greeting as I arrived. I've just come here from the home of the Israeli ambassador, where she was hosting Lily Ebbert and Dov Foreman. Most of you will be aware of Lily. If you haven't been aware, it means you're not on TikTok, and I just don't understand it. But she's a 98-year-old Holocaust survivor, and with her great-grandson, who's 17, they have 1.9 million followers on TikTok. They've got a book that they co-authored called Lily's Promise, and they are sharing her story. She is just sort of, indomitable, and it's just incredible to see the energy she has. But they were there with 20 young people who are not Jewish. They are Holocaust Educational Trust ambassadors. So young ambassadors meeting the ambassador. And the reason they were there was they were there to hear from Lily, to ask her challenging and difficult questions. They were asking her about what she thinks about Nazi war criminals being tried today. They were asking her about how did she have hope during those dark times. She actually was in Israel when Israel was created in 1948, an incredible thing, so she talked about what that means to her. And this is to a group of a non-Jewish audience. And I just mention it because I came away, despite the fact that we're marking Yom HaShoah, I found it really uplifting. It gave a really powerful message for these young people who, as a result of working with the Holocaust Educational Trust, have understood why we should remember, but also are comfortable sitting in the home of the ambassador to Israel and understanding the relationship of Israel to us as a Jewish community. And I just mention it because I thought it was really, really special. So the final thing I want to say before I introduce Ruth is the power of testimony. And Ruth knows this, and I feel like I'm making her even more at unease, because I've actually never seen Ruth speak to an audience. No pressure at all, Ruth. And I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing what is an incredible story. I know her story, but I've never heard her deliver it. Testimony is the first-hand experience. We can read about it in books, we can watch films, we can visit the sites, and I do all of those things. We take thousands of young people from across the country to learn. But hearing from the eyewitness is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And we have that honour to hear from you, Ruth, because as a result of hearing from you, we carry your legacy, and we will tell other people about what we've heard and why it's so important to remember the individual experience of people who went through the Holocaust. Not one experience is the same. That's what's so incredible about this period of history. So Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate. He said that when you hear from a witness, you become a witness. So this evening, we all become witnesses to you, Ruth, and it's now my pleasure to hand over to you. You can sit down and speak from there, and I know everybody's really looking forward to hearing from you. So ladies and gentlemen, Ruth Posner.
Well, can you hear me? Yes. I am absolutely overwhelmed. Thank you very much. And I have a confession to make. Believe it or not, this is the first time I'm doing anything like this. However, to people who are all Jewish, I imagine, and who perhaps know quite a lot about the greatest human stain on humanity, which I call Holocaust. And so, in a way, I'm very nervous because I've never spoken to an audience like you. I usually speak at schools, and organizations for young people. So people who are not actually totally aware, I mean, they know something about the Holocaust, but not really in details. And they do not realize how old the hatred of Jews is. So we sometimes talk about blood libels, they don't know anything about, and the stories that circulated before the Holocaust as we know. So this is normally what I do. But you are an audience I never had before. So I'm quite nervous. But anyway, I'll make an effort. Well, first of all, I want to say I was an only child, born in Warsaw, but then we moved to another place called Radom, and both my parents were very hardworking, and both had different talents. Well, they were both very artistic. My mother designed clothes and underwear for women, but she also had the most gorgeous singing voice, and I remember as a little child listening to her. My father, who was a chartered accountant, also was a very good painter, and really better than just an amateur painter. So there was a lot of this artistic thing going on. I remember getting for a present a Polish national costume, which was my greatest present. And then I danced the Krakowiak and the mazurka, and that, so we actually had I had a very, very happy childhood. Now I also have to confess, my father called himself a humanist, whatever that was in those days. We were secular, we were not very religious. We had a great sense of being Jewish, but not abiding by any religion. So we had a number of Catholic friends. Now I have to confess, one thing I have learned in my old age, and believe me, it is an old age now, is never to generalize. Poland was a highly anti-Semitic country. There's no doubt about that. The church had a great power. The whole idea that Jews being Christ killers ought to be punished, permeated the culture. So that is true. But at the same time, I am here because of the help that we got from Catholic friends, which I shall tell you in more details. So this is one thing I have learned, and I'm actually more adamant about it now in my old age. And that applies even to Germans. And remind me to tell you a story, because when I became an actress, not a well-known one, not a fame, but you know, I did a play which was about the Second World War. The character I played was very similar to my experiences. And this play was taken to Germany, and people said to me, how can you go to Germany? Why are you going to Germany? I said, well, because there is a new generation there. Mind you, that was 25 years ago. Things like constant change, they have changed again. So 25 years ago, I said, yeah, I want to meet the young generation. And we were welcomed at a university where we did this performance. And the chancellor of the university came to greet us. And there was a little bit in the local paper, the fact that I'm a Holocaust survivor. And when he came into the room, I have to say, he looked very Teutonic. By that I mean, front, back and side, terribly Germanic looking. And my heart kind of sank a little bit. And then that man comes to me, opens his arms, and says, you have no idea what this means to me, the fact that you are here. I was a Hitlerjugend during the war. I wore my costume, my uniform, my swastika. I was proud of who I was. We have to learn. Now look, we are more or less the same age, which is true. And tears were pouring down this strong Teutonic man's face. And I will never forget that. That of course things change, they're in constant change, but this generalization, and the same thing, I suppose, goes for some Catholics. Some betrayed members of my family who died, and I survived because of it. So, the first thing that happened, and as I said, my father was, I had an incredibly happy childhood. When the war broke out and the Germans occupied Warsaw Uprising, we didn't realize really what was going to happen. And my father had two younger brothers who insisted on going then to Palestine, and said to my father, why don't you come with us? And my father said, well, I have a lot of friends here. He didn't quite envisage of the thing that might happen. So when the war broke out, we were not prepared. I mean, I don't think many people knew, but we were certainly not prepared. And shortly, maybe, you must realize I'm in my 90s now, so dates are very difficult for me. So I know things happen. I have a very strong impression on my mind, on my heart, that it happened, but I can't remember for how long it lasted or when exactly it happened. So the first incident that became a warning sign, we were living in our flat, which we liked very much, and there was a bang bang on the door, and there were two SS men saying, 20 Minuten und heraus. 20 minutes, out. And we were absolutely astounded. We didn't understand what they wanted. But what they did want is for us to leave our home, and they were going to take us to the ghetto, where there were other Jews. Now, as I mentioned to you before, because we were assimilated or emancipated, or call it what you will, we didn't come in touch with the very religious Jews with payot and hats and so on. And so they marched us to their ghetto. And it's not the first time, but we saw a number of very religious-looking Jews being there. It was a little house with small dirty rooms, and we were going to stay there for I don't know how long, with people that we learned to communicate with, but who were a bit strange to us. I mean, it's a fact, I have to admit. So, because of my father having a number of Catholic friends, he was determined to do something, and to this day, I have no idea how he did it. There were no mobiles in those days. How he communicated with other people, I have no idea, but the fact is, he wanted to do anything possible to save me. My mother was very attached to my father, and she wouldn't let go of him. And my aunt was living with us because her husband died, and her two children were hiding with Catholic farmers. Both the children, 8 and 6, blonde, blue-eyed. So they passed away, they were very much looking like Polish Catholics themselves. And my father wanted me to be able to have a false passport and see what I could do with it. It was like a fantasy, but he was determined to do it. And also my aunt was prepared to come with me, thinking that her children were okay, but for a while they were, but that's another story. So, how he obtained the false passports, I will never know. But my name became Irena, not Ruth, Irena Slabowska. My aunts became Leonia Ruck, and my father said, hide it, and you will use it whenever possible. And at the same time, there was a possibility of us going to work. There was slave labor in a factory which wasn't very far from the town where we were, a German leather factory making rucksack. So he again arranged how, I will never know, that my aunt and I go and work as slave laborers in that factory because it was safer than staying in the ghetto. Because what I haven't mentioned, and it took some time to realize, that at night usually there were screams, haraus, haraus, and they were taking some people from the house where we were living, pushing them on trucks and deporting them, and that already has started. So what my father wanted is for me to be out of the ghetto because they were, well, dangerous, but less so. Okay, so I learned how to, I don't know, so I'm too left-handed, you know, I'm very, very bad, and sometimes I was screamed at because I couldn't do the work, but my aunt was better at it, and so we were working as slave laborers. Now, the Germans had one thing, they were very hygiene conscious, and the condition in the factory were terrible. So once a week, they would march us to the public bath. And we had to, you know, wash ourselves because they were afraid maybe of disease beginning to spread. And the public house was on the edge of the ghetto, on the other side. And I'm not sure how many meters. There was the Aryan side, and here was the ghetto. My aunt already had the false passports. And that I do remember, and never will I forget. She said, we have to try and escape. If we stay here, it's a certain death, sooner or later. If we try to cross, it's a possible death, but there is also a possible life. And those were her words I will never forget. And it truly just meant going from here across to the other side. So what she did, there were two gendarmes, two SS men patrolling, walking backwards and forwards, and she just said, watch me. When I give you the sign, you follow me. Don't run, just follow me. What she was waiting is for the two guys to have a cigarette, to turn the backs. I mean, when I talk about it, I think, my God, this is impossible. But actually it happened. They were talking to each other, smoking a cigarette, and she gave me the sign. And so we walked, and she said, don't run, go slowly. And we got to the other side. Years later, when we visited Israel, and I went to Yad Vashem, there were films showing people trying to do the same thing, and they were spotted and killed on the spot. We managed to cross to the Aryan side with our false passports. And again, the friends of my father, she had an address of somebody to whom we went and could stay with. So from now on, we were different people, different identity. Now, it was still quite dangerous because, unfortunately, my uncle, my mother's brother, tried to do the same with his daughter. They lived in Lvov, brings memories, and somebody denounced them. Again, there were some Poles who said, yeah, they're Jews, and they were taken and killed on the spot. So there was always this danger. So we were extremely, extremely nervous, but we were alive. And very grateful to the people who took us in, who also risked their lives. Because if they were discovered by the Germans, they would be shot. Now, I have to move on. So we stayed there in Warsaw, Irena and Leonia, two different personalities, until date I remember, 1942, the Warsaw Uprising. Now, the ghetto by this time was already finished. A lot of people were deported, a lot of people were killed, so it was finished, and also burned. I think there were fires, it was finished. So this was the Warsaw, the famous Warsaw Uprising, where the Poles, the Christian Poles, fought against the Germans. And it's a very famous event, historical event. And I think there was some sort of hope that the Russians, or maybe I mustn't mention the Russians now, but the Russians were supposed to come and help, and they didn't. So the whole thing was a fiasco. It lasted for about 3 or 4 days. A lot of people got killed. The Polish rebels. My aunt was a little bit involved in that as well, and finished, and the Germans took over. And then a new life started for us, because we were taken as prisoners of war. Not as Jews, Polish prisoners of war. And there was a whole group of us, my aunt and I, of course, and we were taken to Detmold, to Germany. I have many lives and many coincidences. So I spent about a year maybe as a prisoner of war, but as a Christian prisoner of war. Life wasn't easy, there was not much food, conditions were terrible, but there was no comparison between that and Auschwitz or Birkenau or any of the other. So we were happy in a way that we were there, that we were still alive. Now, another strange coincidence or historical event. I think the war was coming to the end, nearly. And what the Germans wanted to do, and I shall never know till my dying day, they wanted to transport us to another place, or they wanted to finish us off. Because by that time, Jews or not Jews, we were Poles, right? But we were enemies. So they wanted maybe to finish us. I shall never know. But what happened was unbelievable. So they said, on the train, everybody, the Germans, the prisoners of war, were on the train, and we're going destination unknown. And we are passing through Essen. Essen is big industrial German town. And all of a sudden, we hear strange noises, aeroplanes. And then all of a sudden, bombs dropping. I mean, I said, the doors of the trains open, the Germans say, heraus, 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 everybody out, run. American bombers, thinking, well, there is a lot going on here, and it's an industrial town, we have to destroy it. They didn't know, who was there. So we ran outside, everybody, with the Germans, put ourselves down on the grass, and hoped for, I don't know, I mean, the fact that we survived was another miracle, because the planes came down, then machine gun, and a lot of people got killed. And I thought, well, maybe that is the end, and maybe where's my aunt? Miraculously, after that, my aunt screams, Irena, 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 run, run. So, I mean, when I talk about it, I think, like, well, did it really happen? Is it a story? It is an incredible story. So my aunt and I started running. And she was alive, and I couldn't believe it, and I was alive. And we ran, and the Germans ran in many different directions. There was a panic, general panic. We come across a hut, sort of German farmers. And we were, you know, in a terrible state. My aunt spoke very good German. And she said to the farmer, we are prisoners of war. And you know, you've heard what happened. Could you give us some water, please? Because we were absolutely, you know, parched. And of course, the woman didn't, you know, we were Poles. She didn't know we were Jews. I don't know what she would have done. I can't suppose what the reaction would have been. But I said, yeah, come in, come in. And then she said, okay, you know, if you want to do some work, you can stay here for some time. I learned how to milk cows. And my aunt was helping in the kitchen. And we were with this couple of German farmers, believe it or not, until the Allies came. The German and, the English and Americans. We were there, it was unbelievable. So, and this is actually what happened. We saw some English soldiers who came over, and I think they were looking for Germans who were hiding. And they came over. I didn't speak a word of English, neither did my aunt, but one of them spoke German. And of course, the first thing she said, we're not German, we're not German, we're not German, we're just hiding here. And those people actually helped us, you know. And she said, and the guy said, okay, well then, you know, get your stuff and come with us, because you can come and help us. We have a compound not very far from here. And my aunt and the farmer, the woman, gave each other a big hug. It's so improbable, but so true. And we parted together with the English people who took us to the compound. And what I remember from that, there were many officers, British officers, and I had to lay the tables. So another, apart from milking cows, now I'm a very good expert table layer. And my aunt was helping in the kitchen. And another coincidence happens, which, believe it or not, you have to believe it, you just have to believe it. There is an English officer in a uniform, the squadron leader, RAF, sitting at the table, and my aunt is serving breakfast. And she puts a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. And he says, with what I now recognize as a frightfully upper class English accent, you can tell the chef that this is for squadron leader Scott. He knows I don't eat bacon. And so I don't know exactly what it was, whether her hand shook or whether something crossed her face. And he said, I want to have a word with you afterwards, which he did. So what he said was, yes, as you see, I work for the RAF, I'm a squadron leader, but I have a personal mission. And the mission is to find remaining Jews. Do you know him? Unbelievable. She said, she could hardly breathe. She said, this is my niece. Her name is Ruth. We're Jewish. And so he said, well, I'll sort you out. She wanted to go to Brussels because her husband's family, a few survivors were there. And he said, and I can help Ruth to come to England. So he arranged a little kinder transport. in 1945, I came to England. So that, believe it or not, is quite several lives that I've had. And they were all coincidences. And when I'm talking to you, I swear, I said to myself, I'm not making it up. I'm not making it up. It actually happened, and it's unbelievable. So, I came here. What I really desperately wanted is to go back to school, because, you know, I couldn't do any adding up, I couldn't do any maths, I was very, very uneducated, and I wanted to go to school. So, he found, Sidney Scott found a place for me, which was two Jewish German women, and they run a little place for refugees sort of hostel, and I stayed there. And it's very strange because they were in some ways very Germanic, but they were very strict, but they helped me with English. It's a wonder I didn't get a German accent. But they helped me, and they found a school for me in Reading, which was a very good school. And that's it. And then, the rest of my story is not very complicated, but I finished my school certificate in 1 year, or 1 year and a half. I couldn't do it now. I think I was brighter then. So I learned enough English to get my school cert. I couldn't go to university because I couldn't do any science. But I studied. I always wanted to, I could move. I was sort of good in dance. And I studied dance and became a member of the London Contemporary Dance Theatre, and after that, I also got fed up with just moving my body, so I wanted to speak as well. So I changed gear, I was sort of ashamed to say it. I wanted to be an actress. Oh, it's so frivolous. What actress, for God's sake? But quietly, that's what I wanted to do. So I started acting and then did both. Taught physical theatre at the Royal Academy of Drama, the London Academy of Drama, the Juilliard School in New York, and I could go on, but I think my time is over. Finished.
Amazing, what a story. What a story. I don't know where to start. I'd like to open up to the floor to some questions. I have a couple of questions, if I may. I'd like to know if you remember those 20 minutes when they knocked on your door. What was the atmosphere like in your home? What did you pack in those 20 minutes? And do you have any recollections of those moments?
To be honest, no, and I was quite young. But it was kind of being paralyzed, knowing that there's no way out. I mean, with the guys with guns, heraus. So we knew it wasn't an invitation, and we were petrified, but we just followed it. And as I said, as a family, my father, my mother, me, we were strong. We were just clinging together. That's all I can say.
We have some questions in the audience.
First of all, thank you very much for your story. It's very interesting. But I'm wondering, did you ever find out what happened to your parents?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I could hear that I'm getting deaf, but I actually could hear you. And I'm very pleased you asked that question, because I knew they died, but I didn't know where. And that's another story of not generalizing. Years and years ago, I went to the Vienna Library, and the Vienna Library had data about a lot of things that happened. The Vienna Library was managed by two young women, both German, both not Jewish. And I told them the story, and I said I would like to know what happened to my father and mother.
What was their name, your parents' name?
Sorry?
What was the name of your parents?
Your mum and dad, what did they
Your
call
mum and dad, what was
their
their name?
Anna and Mariam.
And what was the last name?
Weisberg.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So, where was
So
I?
you were in the library and you
Oh,
asked them.
that's right. So I said, yeah, oh yes, and they came, the two German women came back and said, "Look, we're terribly, terribly sorry. We have a lot of data about Berlin, about other places. We have very little data about Warsaw, I'm afraid." So I said, "Doesn't matter, look, I've lived with it now for many, many years, forget about it." And he says, "No, no, no, do you have time? Do you have time? Do you want a cup of coffee? Sit down, and we'll find out." I did. And they called Yad Vashem. Unbelievable. Those two German women said, "We have to find out." They called Yad Vashem. I was sitting there having my coffee, and two sheets of paper came, very, tidily done. One for my father, one for my mother. And unfortunately, the thing which I found incredibly upsetting, because I mentioned to you that they had a very strong relationship. They were separated, and they died in Treblinka. The sheets were from Treblinka, but they were 2 months apart, so they were obviously separated. And the two German women and me hugged and cried, and it was an incredible experience. Incredible.
Any more questions from the audience? Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your story. I just wondered if you could share something that sticks in your mind of a really positive Jewish memory of pre-war Warsaw, like the atmosphere in the streets, a Friday night, a Seder night, just anything that comes to mind.
Do you have any positive memories of
Jewish memory. A positive Jewish memory.
of pre-war Warsaw?
Well, as I told you, I'm a bit deaf.
Did you get the question? Yeah.
I also worked in the Dome. Well, there's another story. This is what made me deaf. It's like being a pop musician. I had things going into my ears, and anyway, it's a long story. It's another story. Okay. All I know, and as I said before when I started talking, I had an extremely happy childhood. That's all I know. I mean, I was quite good at sort of dancing and showing off, I suppose, and I was encouraged in that direction. I had good friends. It was, all I can say was extremely happy childhood. My father, who I told you was very good at painting, but also making things. If I was in a school play or I held some dance, it was necessary, he would make it for me. Or I was dancing a bird, so he would make the wings, So I remember such memories, happy, happy times.
Do you ever remember a Friday night, like a Shabbat, or lighting candles?
Well, no, because as I said, my grandparents were very religious, were traditional Orthodox, and I loved them, and they used to come and visit us, but, because it wasn't a very Orthodox home. So my father called himself, as I said, a humanist, which is, it's not that he denied religion, he didn't follow religion.
You said you had two uncles that had gone to Palestine. Was it two uncles? Your father's
You
brother?
had two uncles that went to Palestine. Yeah? Yeah? And what's the question?
Oh, yes, I heard.
And their
And
families.
what happened to them?
Well, it was very funny. I discovered that because I married very young. And I've been married for 72 years. And UNICEF. So we moved around a lot. And so we lived in the States and, you know, blah, blah. But before he joined UNICEF, I'm sorry, he was also an organic chemist. So before he joined UNICEF, he was asked to come to Israel to get protein from plants. I mean, you know, I'm an idiot, I don't quite know, but organic chemists would tell me. Extracting protein from plants. And he was a specialist in this. So he said, well, shall we get married? You know, come on, I've been asked to do this job in Israel. I said, not a bad idea, and I meet my uncles. So that's exactly what happened. So actually we lived in Israel for 5 years, long time ago, which was shortly after the date of independence, the 48.
Amazing.
Yeah. So listen, this is what I say usually when people ask me, what is the secret of marital longevity? I said, move around.
Together.
Yeah.
John has a question. John.
Hi, Ruth. You mentioned how you never shared your story before the public tonight, so I was wondering what made you want to share your story tonight.
You said you never shared your story before tonight. I think you met in a synagogue environment. You've never come into a synagogue before?
Yes, of course I've been
No,
to
to speak of, to tell
No, never.
So what,
No, I was very nervous.
and what motivated you to speak to a Jewish audience in a synagogue this evening?
You!
I mean, you can't just say. I was going to say, it's not because we asked you. How does it feel speaking in a synagogue?
Actually, it feels very good.
Well, you're invited back whenever you want. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely so moving and fascinating. And you tell your story with such energy and life, and you can see that you come from the performing arts. You convey the emotion of the moment so beautifully. Thank you. I'd love to hear a little bit, if you don't mind, about how you've thought about the Holocaust since, how you've reconciled this terrible stain on humanity, as you've said, this terrible time, with what we see today, and how do you think about it? How do you come to terms with it?
How have you come to terms with the Holocaust? How have you processed the events of the Holocaust in the context of what we see today?
Sorry, and also, how old were you when this was happening?
It took me a lot of thinking. It's a very good question. I came to the conclusion that there is good and evil in everything, in humanity, in the history of humanity. There is good and there is evil. This evil, that's what I said, stain, is probably the deepest, because it's, what is it? It's not fighting because of land, right? Most wars, what's happening now in Russia? Okay, we have megalomaniac who wants to return to the USSR as it was. So he doesn't care, you know, he wants the country. So there's just crazy reason. But all tribes, Sunni Shiites, okay? But the hatred of the Jews is inexplicable. And so I did think a lot about it. Let me just tell you a story. I don't know if you will agree with it. My husband doesn't agree with it. And I don't know if you read Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah.
Okay. In his book, he's an Israeli historian. In his book, Yuval Noah Harari says the cause of anti-Semitism is the following. You don't have to agree with me, he says. The Jews were the first who declared monotheism. There's only one God. Until then, the Greeks, the Romans believed in many gods. Yuval Noah Harari says, was a mistake, maybe, because if you have many gods, they can quarrel between themselves, which they did. They weren't very nice gods from the little of history that I know. So he said, it wasn't a good idea. But then the worst happens. Abraham declared them to be the chosen people. And Yuval Harari says, oi, that was a mistake. Because now, you know, they say, oh, the Jews, they think they're the chosen people. Huh? So that's his theory. Or some chosen people say, we're the chosen people. Okay, it's only his theory. My husband doesn't agree with that, but that's what he says.
I just want to ask you another question. There was a follow-up. How old were you when the war broke out, when you moved, when you had to leave
Oh my
your
God,
home?
I'm 93 now.
Work it out is the answer. So that was one of the questions.
Yeah, so all right. When I war broke out, I must have been about 13 or something like that.
Younger, yeah.
Yeah.
10, 9, 10.
Yeah.
There's another question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. I had a question as to whether you've ever had the opportunity to speak to kids in Poland.
Have you ever had the opportunity to speak to kids in Poland?
If there's a big difference in the way the whole...
Well, not really. Now, you mentioned Poland. Then I have to tell you another story, because that aunt I mentioned that I was escaping with, she was an extraordinary woman. The children, that's a very sad story. I mentioned 8-year-old and 6-year-old hiding with Polish farmers.
Well, hang on, who's 8 and 6-year-old?
Her children.
They were in
Her
hiding,
children.
because we never heard what happened to her. She went to Brussels.
No,
right.
yeah. Well, the children were hiding with the farmers, and the farmers were fine. But a neighbor declared, the neighbor knew that they were Jewish children, and denounced them. And this is again why the Holocaust is the greatest stain on humanity. They denounced 2 children for the crime they had committed. They were Jewish. So they were taken and shot.
And then your aunt, after the war, she went to Brussels.
So my aunt, now, well, what can I say? She wanted the world to be a better place. I mean, she said she looked after me, because if I weren't there, she would have killed herself. So I, in fact, said, that's what she said, stopped her from the final action. But she believed in communism. Wait a minute. Okay. She worked for the Polish miners. She thought that communism would be better because there wouldn't be that incredible differences between religions, because life would be better. She believed in the, you know, in the good things that communists advertise us. So believe it or not, she went back to Poland. And she spoke also, she was going to come to England eventually, but no, and she spoke French and Russian, and, you know, so we used to visit her, since she was the only surviving relative I had. We used to visit Poland. And boy, oh boy, did we see terrible, terrible changes. Did we see what did not work under communism. And she married again and met a Jew who was a barrister, who also was a communist, and became very high-ranking in the army. And okay, fine. But slowly and slowly, she became very disillusioned, And in, I think the date was more or less 70-something, he was demoted. And it was such a shock for him, because he was Jewish, communist, who believed in it, and he was demoted because he was a Jew. And it killed him. And my aunt, alas, maybe too late, changed her mind. And we used to visit her, as I said, once every year, because she was the only surviving relative I had. So every year we used to go to Poland. And we saw incredible changes. And we saw incredible injustices. She, when she was member of the Communist Party, used to get $25 a month. $25 a month was a fortune. You could go to special shops. You could get coffee. You could get chocolate. You could get food the ordinary people couldn't get. And then she slowly started seeing that it didn't do what it was set out to do. And she became very disillusioned. And then the second husband died. So she went through a hell of a lot. And we learned through her. 6 years running, we used to go to Poland every year.
Got time for one final question. Is there any more questions from the audience?
I'll ask a final question otherwise. I think when you go to schools and you talk to young people, after everything you've experienced and also what you've lost, what is your message for future generations? What do you say to people they should think about? What should they reflect on? What's your message for future generations?
Well, as I already mentioned before, don't generalize. Treat every person. I mean, there is a reason, of course, because of the culture, because of the education, so we become certain people. But even then, not to generalize and to treat every human for who they are intrinsically, rather than what they believe, unless they're bloody fascists.
Ruth, just on behalf of everybody here, we just want to extend a huge thanks to you. We'd like to invite you back to Simchas Torah for the ladies dancing. I'm sure Tina would love to lead that with you. But on a serious note, hearing your story this evening has given us such emotion and such a deeper understanding, and your smile and your manner is incredible, and we look forward to seeing you and hosting you again. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming.